Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Flex podcast. I am your host, Samantha Bravidi, and I am joined as always by the one and only Mike Triplett, longtime Saints beat reporter, who you can follow on Twitter at Mike Triplett. Mike, another huge win yesterday in this wide open NFC South. What do you make of this? And yeah, we got the Buccaneers. They were almost losing that game. So, I'm a little bummed about that, but I don't even know. I'm not sure if I'm rooting for the Panthers at this point.
Well, we work for the Action Network. The thing that I have learned is whatever in-game bets you can make, whatever live betting you can do, that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers won't show up for the first 50 minutes of a game, and then they'll ruin your hopes and dreams in the last 10 minutes in overtime if they need to. We've seen that story over and over again. They hurt the Saints twice doing that. Last night, if Arizona would have held on, the Saints and Panthers would both have a clear path to the playoffs. Now the Panthers have to do it themselves next week.
Yeah, I guess it's all in the Panthers' sort of hands at this point. If they
control their own destiny.
Exactly. If they happen to win out, which is asking a lot because they've already won the last two games. So this would be a 4-game win streak to end out the year. But if they were to happen to win out, I mean, they would be hosting a playoff game against the Dallas Cowboys, which is just pretty crazy at what it would be 8-9. So, yeah. Pretty crazy
we could have a couple of 8 and 9 division winners in both Souths this year.
Ooh, yes. Speaking of which, we can just jump right into the news. Ryan Tannehill is likely out for the season. The Jaguars have now jumped to -225 favorites to win the AFC South. We saw Malik Willis this week again. Not really great impacts on that Titans offense. So maybe I'm with Vegas there that I think that the Jaguars could end up being the team out of the South.
Well, and for the fantasy advice, Treylon Burks came back, and you wouldn't know it by reading the box score. We love the rookie tight end there, but if Malik Willis is the quarterback, I don't think you can use anybody except for Derrick Henry.
I feel the exact same way. It's pretty brutal. There were a number of sort of quarterback substitutions this week. Gardner Minshew, we were just talking about him before we started recording. Minshew Mania was alive and well at AT&T Stadium. Obviously, they did not get the win, but it was against the number 3 ranked defense, according to DVOA. Minshew completed 24 of 40 attempts for 355 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, rushed for 5 yards and a touchdown. So, I mean, that's pretty much on par with what I thought he would put up. But Hurts' status is up in the air for week 17. I know he is pushing to play against the Saints. That is a very, very consequential game for the Saints there. So that could have huge implications. What did you think of Gardner Minshew's sort of performance and debut this season?
I mean, I'd love to have, I had him in a really important fantasy playoff game that I won because I had Lamar Jackson and Ryan Tannehill on that team. But I would feel perfectly comfortable starting him again this week, even though the Saints have had a pretty good pass defense this year. And that game's going to mean a lot for Philadelphia too, because they didn't actually beat Dallas after giving up that lead in the final minutes. So Philadelphia still has to win another one to secure the 1 seed, to secure the division title even. So if he is the starter, keep playing him. We could be talking like top 10, top 12 option and not just desperation option. But it is very much up in the air. We talked to the Saints coaches today about, having to prepare for both possibilities. I don't think we've gotten a really good clue yet, and probably won't till later this week, on who the starter is going to be there. But they'll be doing it without Lane Johnson. So that will affect the offense a little bit for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure that is complicated to plan for, since they are very different quarterbacks that run different schemes in that Eagles offense. But for sure will be something that you need to monitor the entire week, because it makes a huge difference for fantasy managers. One of the biggest pieces of news that came out today was Nathaniel Hackett has been fired. And I think that a lot of Broncos media had been saying that it was going to happen at the end of the season after week 18. So it did happen. It was on the heels of just an awful game against the Rams. They lost 51-14 to a Baker Mayfield led Rams team. And just, I mean, this is a defense that's supposed to be number 1 ranked in pass DVOA. So that's just definitely not the game scripts that I was expecting. So maybe we don't find out this year, but maybe next year we will find out if Hackett or Russ were like the real problem with this Broncos team.
I'm fascinated to see who they hire. Obviously, Sean Payton's name him will be in the conversation if he's not the guy there. But I mean, everything in Denver comes down to figuring out Russ, because they can't move on from him. They don't have the draft capital to pick the next guy. They do have a late first round pick from another trade, but they don't have theirs. So figuring out Russ is the key to Denver, and it's going to be fascinating from a fantasy standpoint. It's going to be an undrafted fantasy quarterback in most leagues next year, and I wonder if that's the last we've seen him. We've seen people dip before. We saw Tom Brady dip before he returned in Tampa. So that's going to be a fascinating storyline going into next season. Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady. Are these great all-time great quarterbacks done, or was this a blip on the radar? But that's gonna be what the next coach is tasked with, without question.
Definitely. I'm actually running a Twitter poll right now of which team messed up the most at the quarterback position, and that's Broncos versus the Browns. Obviously, Deshaun Watson had another disappointing game against your Saints. So currently leading the poll are the Broncos. I don't know if that's just because it was just so rancid on
Samantha. Why aren't the Panthers on this poll? Not only did they trade for Baker Mayfield, they gave up on him right before he goes out and leads a 51-point effort.
They did not give up multiple firsts for Baker Mayfield. So it was a pretty low risk. I think it was a 5th round pick or something like that. So it was a pretty low risk trade relative to what we're talking about with Deshaun Watson and Russell Wilson, at least. So, but yes, I mean, that's painful to watch. It's like watching your ex date someone that's way more attractive. So yeah, I mean, whatever, it's fine. In terms of other quarterback turmoil around the league, Mike White has been cleared for contact, already named the starter for week 16 against the Seahawks. Zach Wilson back to the bench. It's been a painful sort of 3-game stretch there, but I think this will be good news for Garrett Wilson and Zonovan Knight and the rest of this offense, who were looking pretty bad with Zach Wilson. And I kind of wonder where that leaves Zach Wilson in his future with this franchise or otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if unfortunately, they were so good early this season. I don't know if they'll be in position to draft anybody new, but it's hard to imagine they go into next year with Zach Wilson as their starter. But you're absolutely right. You can trust Garrett Wilson in your fantasy Super Bowl lineups and your daily leagues and all that again now. You can maybe trust Elijah Moore in those leagues. Zonovan Knight, I'm still a little shaky on, though. That might have been a little bit of a flash in the pan. And now that Michael Carter is back, he's going to be splitting time. I think that you have to be a little more desperate, but all of them are in better shape than they were before that news came out.
Look, it's just painful to watch the Jets only be able to put up 3 points on the Jaguars, who I believe are dead last in pass DVOA. So that was a disappointing performance, even given that we knew Zach Wilson was starting the game. But we did have a number of games this week impacted by weather, the Saints and Browns being one of them. The Bills actually still put up 35 points on the Bears. That one I know was a cold and snowy one. The Titans game, which was actually delayed, right, a couple hours before game time, they delayed it an hour because no one in Tennessee had power. That ended 19-14. Kind of talked about that one a little bit. The Jets were impacted by weather right off the bat, 19-3, like I said. So there are a number of games kind of just that were a little wonky this week. I personally, no one cares about my fantasy lineups, but personally, I suffered from a lot of these weather impacted games. So it was a bummer. And that did lead to a number of unlikely high scorers this week. And some of these will come up in the waivers, but Jared Goff, QB2, Gardner Minshew, QB5, Cam Akers pops off and becomes the RB1. What an emotional roller coaster it has been for Cam Akers. Donta Foreman, who I did not think was going to do well against this Lions run defense. And I mean, the Panthers just ran all over the Lions. So it was just an absolutely crazy performance there. Kendrick Bourne was the wide receiver 6, Isaiah Hodgins, wide receiver 7. Shane Zylstra, the tight end 4.
Oh my gosh, that's the most random for last. Yeah.
Mercedes Lewis, like I wasn't even sure that he was still playing in the NFL. So he was the tight end 10. So definitely a lot of randomness there.
Samantha, somewhere out there is somebody who held on to Cam Akers as long as they could, dropped him, and then got knocked out of the playoffs by him this weekend.
Yes.
You know that happened to several people who probably don't listen to the show anymore.
Pour one out for them. I did start Cam Akers in the 2 places that I had him, so I felt good about that. But At least on the injury front, we were pretty light. The only one that I could think about in terms of like being potentially in your fantasy Super Bowl lineups would be Christian Watson, suffered a hip injury, did not return to Sunday's game against the Dolphins. But let's just jump into the waivers by position, starting with quarterbacks. Brock Purdy would probably be towards the top of my list if Gardner Minshew is not playing. I think Gardner Minshew has to be your number one if it looks like he is the starter. But Brock Purdy, impressive yet again. I mean, currently the QB 13 heading into Monday night. Since taking over for Jimmy G, he's QB 18, QB 8, QB 14, and QB 13. And he gets the Raiders this week, who rank 31st in pass DVOA. So I think that he could be a streaming option if Jalen Hurts doesn't play and Gardner Minshew isn't available. Minshew, of course, like I said, very impressive, currently the QB5. So they do face the Saints. I don't think that's the easiest matchup, but certainly feels like he could still muster QB1 numbers out. And then and then Mike White is the guy that we have been mentioning a lot. He had actually looked pretty good for the other members of that team, and he is a usable, I think, QB2 at the Seahawks this week. Do you have any thoughts about those guys or anyone else on your radar?
Yeah, well, I love Brock Purdy's final two matchups against the Raiders and the Cardinals, if you're in a league that goes all the way to week 18. And we were wondering about the injuries at receiver there, but somebody loves George Kittle again. It's a good reminder that some quarterbacks, love. He's turning back into Travis Kelce there. So he's got plenty of options. He can obviously throw to Christian McCaffrey too. He by far and away, him and Minshew are two guys that I would start with confidence in really important games. Less confidence in Mike White and Baker Mayfield. They're legitimate options though, but you can't ignore what Baker Mayfield just did. I mean, 24 of 28 he finished. I think he completed like 18 of his first 19 or something crazy like that. He's playing real football there. I don't expect 51 points again against the Chargers, but it's not an impossible matchup. So he's not a bad option. He really isn't. Sam Darnold will be going against the Buccaneers. I don't think that's a great matchup. So I'd put him below Baker Mayfield, almost ironically enough.
Yes, ironically enough. I mean, I don't know how much to make of this Baker Mayfield sort of comeback. I mean, it is impressive, credit where credit is due, against the Broncos, who have been absolutely crazy good against the pass this year. So I mean, he is a viable option for 2 quarterback or super flex leagues, or even if you're in like a 16-team league and you happen to lose a quarterback. Like I don't hate that for sure. In terms of the running back position, guys that I am looking at are James Cook. He's just over 50% rostered. The Bills obviously leaned very heavily on their run game in that freezing cold game that we just talked about. Cook and Devin Singletary split work on the ground pretty evenly, but Cook is the RB9 in half PPR with 1 game left to play. He actually outsnapped Singletary by he was outsnapped by Singletary by a count of 26-37, but this still remains a pretty legitimate sort of a running back by committee situation. And in the Bills offense, he still offers a lot of upside. So he's a rookie that's been on my radar since before the draft for sure. Chuba Hubbard, we talked about the Panthers just kind of dominating on the ground, which is not necessarily how I thought that game would play out, just given how the Lions defense has looked so weak against the pass and then pretty good against the run. But again, another 1A, 1B type situation with Donta Foreman. Tyler Algier has been looking pretty good. I mean, he had a massive week 15 and then rushed 18 times for 74 yards and caught 4 passes for 43 yards. The RB11 appears, though, that he has emerged as maybe the favorite rusher over Cordarrelle Patterson, with maybe Desmond Ridder leading on more of a traditional run game versus that kind of short yardage passing game with Patterson. So that was kind of my takeaway from that game. Any thoughts on those guys or anyone else that's on your radar?
Yeah, I had 4 names that my top 4 names listed are the same top 4 you had listed, with Gus Edwards being the 4th. Yes. The problem is with all 4 of these guys, they all split time. Yep. James Cook, Chuba Hubbard. James Cook and Chuba Hubbard had sort of like breakout games and still both finished second on their own teams behind Deontay Foreman and Devin Singletary. But, Cook, for a minute there, I think we really strongly advocated for him when it looked like, are they just going to turn to him down the stretch? And they've just been waiting to unleash him. And that hasn't really happened, but his snaps have still been there. That week that I'm talking about, he had 32 snaps 4 weeks ago. And he had the big breakout game. And since then he's had 24, 28, 26. So they are still continuing to use him. I don't think he'll put up RB1 numbers, but he's really involved. I mean, it's the same situation for Hubbard. We talked about how he started getting more early down work, and that continued. But as that game wore on, Foreman kind of surpassed him in that role. He has more of the pass catching quality there. But Algier is the one who I think they've really made a shift there. And with Desmond Ridder at quarterback being kind of a shaky quarterback for them, and the same thing, he's not running like Marcus Mariota was. They're giving a lot of volume to Algier too. They're going to play against a Cardinals team that they should be able to run the ball the entire game against. That game should not get away from them. They could be protecting a lead in that game. I think you can feel really comfortable putting Algier in there. One other name that might join this list, you got to watch Monday Night Football to see what the Colts plan to do with Zach Moss and Deion Jackson. We were wondering about that last week. We'll find that out on Monday night. If one of them clearly emerges as their go-to guy, that could be actionable. And then just a couple other names I put in here for more of the desperate. Kenneth Gainwell, we've mentioned him almost every week because he continues to play a small role there in Philly. And then DJ Dallas is kind of quietly. He was dealing with his own injuries, but he's clearly sort of the Chuba Hubbard to what Kenneth Walker's doing there in Seattle.
Definitely. Yeah. To your point about the Hubbard Foreman sort of split there, I think that in games where they're just going to go up and kind of have a decent lead, I mean, I wasn't a huge lead, but it was a decent lead for a lot of that game. That's when Foreman shines, whereas Hubbard is obviously the pass catcher. So it's really just a game script dependent sort of situation for which guy. And the Panthers are just such a weird team that I never know what version of the Panthers are going to show up. So it's one thing to say oh, well, if you think they're going to lead in this game, I don't know, they beat the Buccaneers earlier this season, which seemed like a very improbable win. So,
well, what they're going to do. They're going to be leading Tampa Bay by 10 points with 5 minutes to go. So they'll at least be able to run until Tampa Bay decides to.
Okay. So what you're saying is start D'Onta Foreman. Exactly. Yes, no, Tyler Algier. I think that he could flirt with RB2 numbers this week against the Cardinals. They rank 27th in rush DVOA and have allowed the 8th most fantasy points to running backs this year. So yes, he is the one that I would say has a little bit of a clearer edge in these committee type situations. Gus Edwards, it's just hard to get excited about anyone in this Ravens backfield because they've just been such a headache for fantasy all season long. So the only positive thing is that they've given up on Kenyon Drake right now. So at least he is not kind of messing up fantasy lineups at this point. But onto the wide receivers, I think there's a little bit better crop here. Jahan Dotson just remains at the top of this list. I get it. Not that many people are super active on waivers this time of year because now most people only have 2 teams that are really in contention to win, or 4 teams if we're going for a 3rd place finish or something like that. But Dotson is only 23% rostered. So, and I actually worried about this matchup. I know that the 49ers haven't been a terrible matchup for wide receivers fantasy wise, but they are still a top team against the pass in terms of DVOA. But Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel all had nice days for fantasy, all found the end zone. Dotson had a team high 9 targets, caught 6 passes for 76 yards and a touchdown. So like I said, I was a little worried about him. I didn't say sit him, but I wasn't quite ready to go all in on him. But now I mean, if he can handle matchups like that, it's pretty impressive. This is his 3rd game in a row with at least 14 fantasy points and a touchdown. We mentioned that he missed a big chunk of time, but in the 10 games he's played in, he's finished as a top 22 receiver in or better in 6 of them. So crazy. I think he's a wide receiver 3 rest of season with the Browns and Cowboys to finish out the year. Those are much easier matchups than the 49ers. DJ Chark has been a frequent flyer on this report as well, just because he's just kind of randomly emerged and has actually performed better with Jameson Williams on the field, which is not necessarily the development that I would think would happen. But since week 12, Chark is the wide receiver 20, has 4 of 5 games with 9 or more fantasy points. So this offense is just very high volume with Jared Goff kind of chucking the ball a lot. So he should be a viable starter this week against the Bears, who ranked 29th in pass DVOA. And then the next guy that I'm going to mention, a couple guys I'm going to mention, are both from the Giants, Isaiah Hodgins and Richie James. Not really sure what to make of who I would take from either of these guys, because they both ended up catching 8 passes each, and it was 89 yards at a touchdown and then 80 yards. Darius Slayton was also involved as well. So it's like this passing game for the Giants has been pretty much put together with like spit and glue, because they don't have a really good alpha receiver. So it's really hard to like put your faith in Isaiah Hodgins. But that said, I mean, he was released by the Bills, picked up by the Giants in November, and really has been on the rise ever since. So I think he's a name to definitely keep an eye on. If you have a deeper league, I really don't hate that matchup. He's facing the Colts this week. Brandon Cooks came back from injury, looked pretty good from a 3-game injury hiatus, led the team in targets, caught 4 of 9 for 34 yards and a touchdown. He's been disappointing this year, but like the Texans, who have 2 wins, aren't really, they don't have a lot of competition for targets there. So
and Nico Collins is out for the year. Yeah.
Yes. And the remaining schedule is Jaguars and Colts. The Jaguars are a very, very good matchup there. So any thoughts on the guys that I mentioned, or any other guys that you like?
Well, first of all, we both have been driving the Jahan Dotson bandwagon, and nobody's listening to us. And 23%, like that's got to be keeper in dynasty leagues too. He has to be 100% rostered in those leagues. If not, even if you miss the playoffs, run out and put him on your lineup.
Absolutely.
It's still legal to do it right now. He's going to be great for years to come. I mean, the talent is there and the opportunity is there. What more do you want in a fantasy pickup? Of course, I'm also scared about Isaiah Hodgins. But the Giants, I was laughing. They must lead the league in most receivers picked up in fantasy leagues this year. It's like every 3 weeks they have 2 new guys who are their number 1 and number 2 receiver. But there is something really there with him. I mean, this is a little bit more for the desperate, but first of all, they picked him up from the Bills, but the Giants' whole staff, GM, coach are from the Bills, so they all know him really well, which is why I think he jumped in there so quick. And this is, I think, 3 or 4 straight games where he's played like 90% of their snaps. So this isn't just fluke numbers he put up. He's been really getting kind of wide receiver 1 snap shares there. So I don't, totally trust him, but it's not a fluke. One other name I think will vault to the top of the list if Christian Watson is going to miss this game is Alan Lazard. He kind of falls into that category of Brandon Cooks, or somebody. He's down in like the 20% rostereds now because he had just disappeared for so long, but he became, the go-to guy after Watson got hurt, and he's kind of steadily been regaining his role there. I mean, you could consider Romeo Doubs too in really deep leagues, but if Christian Watson is out, that's an opportunity there. I mentioned Rashid Shaheed last week for the Saints, and I thought we should ignore him in the frigid weather at Cleveland. But sure enough, he made some big catches in that game. And it's the second week in a row now where he's led them in routes run. He's become their target leader. And one of those games even was with Chris Olave on the field. So Rashid Shaheed is not only a home run threat, but he's getting the opportunity there. I really like him, especially in like daily lineups, but even in your Super Bowl lineups, if you feel like your team could use a home run threat, he's become one. Greg Dortch was getting the volume. I don't know how much you can trust that. We didn't really talk much about Kendrick Bourne with the best game of his career, I think, because he's been around for a long time. So, but Hunter Renfrow is back playing a little bit of a role. Michael Gallup had one of his biggest names. We're not going to talk about Trenton Irwin, I don't think, even though he was one of those surprise, but there's a lot of names to choose from at receiver this week.
Definitely. Yeah. Dortch was an interesting one. I will say interesting because, look, DeAndre Hopkins was in a number of my lineups, and I knew better, but I didn't have a choice. Like, that's the thing, is that sometimes you don't have a choice to sit DeAndre Hopkins. Caught 1 of 10 targets for 4 yards. Marquise Brown held to just 3 catches and 6 targets for 57 yards. And then Greg Dortch caught 10 of 11 targets for 98 yards, rushes 3 times for 25 yards. Yeah. I mean, he's the wide receiver 11 heading into Monday night. Clearly has some good chemistry with third string quarterback Trace McSorley, who could be the Cardinals quarterback rest of way. So,
yeah.
I mean, they face the Falcons this week that rank 30th in pass DVOA, have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. So I'm not saying necessarily trust Greg Dortch in your fantasy championships, but yeah, another name that would be good for daily. And
it reminds me of when we were talking about the Matt Ryan, Paris Campbell chemistry. I mean, if that's the throw your quarterback makes, then the volume's there. But I would think that the coaches in Arizona have to figure out, all right, let's put DeAndre Hopkins in the Greg Dortch role if those are the kind of throws he like making, and they'll probably figure out a way to get the ball in Hopkins' hands much quicker next week, because that is no way to win a game with that game plan they had last night.
Absolutely terrible. One thing I will ask you, any insight as to if Olave or Landry will be playing this week?
Yeah, Landry will not be back. They placed him on IR late in the week, so he's out of the mix for good, which is even more for Shaheed's opportunity. It's a little early to know on Olave. I didn't, I mean, it was a hamstring issue, I believe, so we don't know the severity, but he didn't practice at all last week, so there was never any chance of him playing. So that's when we'll probably learn more out on Wednesday. But Shaheed's worth a flyer pickup either way, and if Olave is out, then he's probably worth a start.
Yeah, I mean, definitely want to have a wide receiver one on any team, even if it's a team that doesn't have necessarily the craziest offensive potential. But one member of the Saints that does have great offensive potential. So let's just talk about the tight ends. Taysom Hill. Yeah. I know you said earlier that people were kind of mad that Taysom Hill wasn't getting fed enough, but he did rush 9 times for 56 yards and a touchdown, currently the tight end 8, which is just kind of funny that he can be tight end 8 with 0 catches, but still one of the higher upside tight end options, and maybe a more reliable one, just considering his usage as a rusher. So, I mean, I think he's definitely going to be a top 12 option against the Eagles and Panthers, both of which have below average defenses against the run. And then the only other name that I could really think of at the tight end position is going to be Noah Fant, 24% rostered. He caught the Seahawks lone touchdown of the day. He's just, I mean, 2 of 3 targets for 12 yards and a touchdown, not like the greatest stat line or anything, but he has been in the mix and has finished as a top 7 tight end in 3 of the last 6 games. So if you're really desperate there, I would say Fant is not a terrible option.
Well, for the Saints, Taysom Hill, now I loved him against Cleveland and actually think this was about like the lowest number of carries he could have possibly had in those frigid conditions. I thought there was a chance he might actually practically serve as the starting quarterback in that game, but he did just enough to make him worth the risk. If like you put him in over Mark Andrews or something on a whim, he still didn't let you down too much. But against Philly, I think it might be a little harder for them to stick with the run and to stick with all those Taysom Hill plans if they get down. That's the risk. Not that they can't run against Philly, but how long can they continue to use their run game if Philly puts up a lot of points on him? So he's not the safest bet in the world in that game, but he's always better than a lot of these other touchdown or bust guys that you're considering. But we can't forget about Juwan Johnson. And I'm not sure if you didn't mention him because I didn't look at his roster percentage. He might have finally crept too high on the roster percentage because he was catching all those touchdowns. That has not changed. He is still their go-to guy in the red zone, especially if Olave is hurt. He's going to go right back to being one of their biggest pass catchers. He just disappeared because of the Cleveland weather. So don't think that, he's not still a big part of this offense because he didn't put up big numbers in Cleveland in whatever 30-mile-per-hour winds. And then also, we could add Greg Dulcich back to the list. We flirted with him all year long, and anytime he puts up a big game, he doesn't seem to follow it up. But he's another one in that Noah Fant range.
Yeah, I wish I could trust anyone in that Denver dumpster fire, but it's pretty tough. Tempers were definitely flaring on the sidelines there.
We should also mention Shane Zylstra because of what he did.
I know, but do we want to chase touchdowns?
But that's the thing. We need to mention him because people probably want to listen to find out who this guy is, and they might think, "Oh, TJ Hawkinson's gone. It was the guy who replaced TJ Hawkinson, and there's opportunity there." Not really. He's been like their third tight end even after Hawkinson left. So this was as fluky can be, but maybe they saw something. It's not a hard hierarchy to climb in Detroit,
sure.
but this is the exact opposite of what we were saying about Isaiah Hodgins. Hodgins has or Rashid Shaheed. Those guys have been playing those roles and getting those opportunities and getting those snaps. So those aren't fluky. Zylstra, this truly came out of nowhere.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it feels fluky, but hey, if you're in a situation where it's just do or die, or you need a miracle, basically, maybe Shane Zylstra could save your fantasy season. But that will do it for the penultimate episode of the Monday Fantasy Flex episode. Mike, please remind everyone where they can find your work.
Yep, I cover the Saints for NewOrleans.football, a subscription site where we get into more of the details on the Saints than anyone. And if you're interested in this team, you're cheating yourself if you're not following us.
All right. Well, yes, all eyes too will be on this Panthers Buccaneers game. Not like that's maybe a joke. I don't know if all eyes will be on that, but just to see the outcome of this division, because it could be pretty consequential. But thank you everyone for joining. Don't forget to email those mailbag questions to mailbag@actionnetwork.com, and we will see you all next week. Peace out, guys.